Hello, my name is Will Levy with the Office of Recapitalization. I am joined here with John Artavini, who is a transaction branch chief in the Office of Recapitalization as well. This is a webinar on the conversion of Section 202 PRACs under RAD, under the Rental Assistance Demonstration. First, we'll start with a little bit of background. So as most folks know, the Section 202 program has gone through three stages. These are all programs that are housing, provide affordable housing for the elderly. They've gone through three stages since 1959. There's the pre-1974 202s, where HUD provided direct loans with no rental assistance. There are, between 1974 and the early 90s, HUD provided direct loans with new Section 8 contracts. Those are called 202-8s. And then since the early 90s, HUD replaced that model, providing 202 capital advance, almost like grants to properties, along with project rental assistance contracts, or PRACs. We call these 202 PRACs. This last portfolio is the portfolio that is eligible for conversion under RAD and for which we are presenting today. There's about 2,800 properties covering 120,000 assisted units that have been placed in service between 1993 and as recently as 2018. So why do we even have RAD for 202 PRACs? RAD was designed to preserve and recapitalize this aging stock of HUD-assisted housing by allowing properties to convert to long-term Section 8 rental assistance contracts. These contracts provide access to debt and equity to finance capital needs, are a strong platform for long-term preservation, and provide robust resident rights. Congress authorized the conversion of 202 PRACs under RAD in the 2018 Appropriations Act. We have since implemented the conversion option for 202 PRACs in a joint housing PIH notice called Housing 2019-09/PIH 2019-23. We call this Rev 4, or the RAD notice, which was published September 5th. There are 4 sections to the notice. The 4th section, of course, is most relevant for the conversion of 202 PRACs, but just for folks' background, Section 1 covers public housing. Section 2 covers the conversion of mod rehab and mod rehab SROs. Section 3 covers the conversion of rent supplement and rental assistance payment contracts, and Section 4 covers 202 PRACs. Section 4 had previously been posted for public feedback early in the spring on multifamily drafting tables. We benefited from hundreds of really helpful comments from a variety of stakeholders that have improved the final deliverable in RAD Notice Rev 4. So owners could use RAD and are likely to use RAD to modernize aging properties, stabilize property revenue, perform and support substantial rehab of deteriorated properties, potentially transfer assistance to better neighborhoods, if in some cases, and also through transferring assistance, thin densities or mixed incomes at properties. RAD is a larger umbrella of properties that 202 PRACs are fitting into. We've got first component conversions, which covers public housing, and then we have what are known as second component conversions, which cover mod rehab, rent sup and wrap, and now 202 PRACs. All these properties are eligible, all these property types are eligible to convert under RAD to one of 2 forms of Section 8 contracts, either PBRA, or project-based rental assistance, multifamily Section 8, or to Section 8 project-based vouchers, which are a component of the Housing Authority's Housing Choice Voucher Program. And we'll get into the detail and distinctions of these in a little bit. Okay, we'll go over in the rest of this presentation the basic program requirements. Of course, they're more fully detailed in the RAD notice, but the purpose of this presentation is to give you an overview of the key requirements. First on contracts and rents. So the rents that will be in the Section 8 HAB contract are based on the PRAC rents that are in the PRAC contract. Remember that the PRAC rents can be adjusted prior to conversion based on budget. They're budget-based rents. So prior to conversion, many owners will likely want to make sure that their PRAC rents are set appropriately with potentially reserves justified by a capital needs assessment, make sure service coordinator salaries are included in supportive service funds, and other expenses. So that's a very key thing. The rents that will be in the Section 8 HAB contract are not set based on standard Section 8 rents tethered to market, but are rather based on the rents that are in the PRAC. The initial contract is 20 years and is renewable. During those 20 years, they would be adjusted by annually by the operating cost adjustment factor, which HUD uses the OCAF. The Section 8 contract that it would be converted to imposes no limitation on the use of project cash flow, so there is no residual receipts accounts. Cash flow is unlimited. In addition to the HAB contract, we replace the capital advance recorded documents, the use agreements, and the note with a RAD elderly housing use agreement, a single document that's recorded, and that adds a required 20 additional years of affordability on the property. It also requires that during the term of the use agreement, the HAB contract, the owner must agree to renewing the HAB contract. So in the next couple of slides, talking through some of the differences between PBRA, or project-based rental assistance, and project-based vouchers. So PBRA is what likely most 202 owners are familiar with because it's administered by HUD. It's funded by the project-based rental assistance account, one of HUD's largest accounts. The HUD performs the contract administration, which means owners would continue to interact with many of the same field staff and field offices. Funding submissions are done through tracks. Financial submissions are done in the same way. So it's standard contract administration performed by HUD. As a property goes through conversion and completes the requirements of conversion that we'll talk through in the rest of this webinar, and reaches closing, the HAB contract would be effective the first of the month, at least 30 days after closing. So if they completed all closing requirements by June 28th in a year, the HAB contract would be effective August 1st. Inspections continue to be done by REAC under the UPCS standard, starting after any required work is completed. Rents, as we discussed earlier, they're based on PRAC rents, but they cannot exceed statutorily 120% of either the fair market rent or the small area fair market rent, whichever is higher. Comparison, owners also have the ability to convert to project-based vouchers. Project-based vouchers are funded out of the tenant-based rental assistance account, another one of HUD's largest accounts, where HUD provides funds to housing authorities who then enter into Section 8 project-based voucher contracts with owners. So the housing authority is the contract administrator, which means they are making HAP payments, managing the waiting list, performing inspections according to housing quality standards. That's the inspection protocol under the PPP program. And in most cases will be a new relationship for owners to enter into. Due to some of the limitations in the RAD statute and how HUD would move funds to fund the new HAF contract by transferring funds across appropriation accounts, any PBV conversions will have contracts with delayed start dates. So the HAP contract, the new PBV HAP contract, following the completion of all conversion closing requirements, the new HAP contract would need to align with the PRAC anniversary date and be at least 90 days from the closing date. So in some cases, that'll be half of a year, up to a year before the new HAP contract could begin. As you said, the inspections are done under the HQS standard, Housing Quality Standards, and performed by the PHA. Rent setting, again, are based, just like PBRA, are based on the PRAC rents, but the cap on those rents is lower. They cannot exceed 110% of the fair market rent. Now I'm going to turn to John Ardavini to talk through some of the requirements of conversion for a property to enter into a Section 8 HAP contract through RAD.
Thanks, Will. Good afternoon, everyone. So when we're talking about conversion requirements for RAD for PRACs, really the most important piece, and we'll start off with that, is the capital needs assessment. It really is going to dictate how your conversion plan will look and move forward. Usually what we see is the more needs that are identified, whether it be immediate or long-term, the more complex and detailed that conversion plan is going to have to be. So what are we looking for in a capital needs assessment? Well, it must be consistent with MAP guide requirements. It can be in any form as long as it's consistent with the MAP guide. The conversion plan, it must cover all needs through either upfront capitalization, and that's, if applicable to your PRAC property, or ongoing capital replacement reserve deposits. Also, the CNA has to be consistent with the CNA you submit for any budget-based rent adjustment in the field prior to your RAD conversion. And we're going to touch on this a bit more later in the presentation about what that means. Another major requirement is the environmental review. Now, for Part 50 is for PBRA conversions or FHA insured conversions. That's where HUD's going to be performing the review in HEROES. And the vendor is actually going to be required to submit all the supporting documentation in the HEROES system. Part 58 is going to be for all other PBV transactions, and that's where a responsible entity performs the review, and that's usually a unit of local government. Davis-Bacon, it's not going to be applicable for rehab of units previously assisted under the PRAC contract, but we are going to explore a bit later on when it can apply in the case of your RAD for PRAC. Moving along to ownership and control. The property it must be owned or controlled by a nonprofit entity. So either you have a current PRAC owner, there's going to be no change in ownership because of the nonprofit control. It can transfer to another nonprofit, or you can have a LIHTC entity controlled by a nonprofit. Some of those structures that can facilitate it, LIHTC, can use some of the following. A nonprofit is a general partner in a limited partnership. They can be a majority owner in a limited partnership or a limited liability corporation, or they can have a long-term ground lease or control agreement. Those are just some examples. You also need to address refinancing or sales proceeds. Net refinancing or sales proceeds with certain allowable exclusions during the remainder of the original capital advance term. Those are going to be restricted to affordable housing purposes, and that term is defined in the revision 4 of the notice for you. Another requirement you're going to need to address is what we call an operating reserve. In lieu of residual receipts account, the owner must establish and maintain an operating reserve account in an amount of $250 per unit, and that's going to be used for project purposes. Some things like unexpected expenses or delinquent receivables can just be some examples. Now, HUD approval is not required for the withdrawal in this operating reserve, but you do need to keep in mind you do need to have a minimum balance as a condition of owner distributions of surplus cash. Another very important piece for the conversion plan for RAD for PRAC owners is to address supportive services for residents. So you must describe your services plan in the conversion plan, and that's actually going to contractually commit to ongoing services at the property upon closing. Now, PRAC owners may already include a service coordinator, as well as a $15 per unit a month for their services in their current PRAC budget, and that's going to be captured in the Section 8 RAD conversion. For properties converting through RAD, HUD may approve an increase in the project budget line item for service costs, say from $15 up to $27 per unit per month. And that's going to be warranted by services. Perhaps you're going to be looking to increase your services at the property to your residents. We're also going to need to look, as part of your conversion plan, at your financing sources, and what we've done here is provide some examples. You can have some first mortgage debt, and we can see some FHA insured debt, whether that be a 223F product that addresses light or moderate rehab. We can see the 221D4 product, which is more for sub-rehab or new construction. We also can see conventional debt. Some other secondary types of financing we'll see: home funds, community development block grant, housing trust fund, Federal Home Loan Bank, and you can also use your existing residual receipts or your replacement reserves as a use as well. And we also see equity in the form of 4% low-income housing tax credits, 9% tax credits, as well as historic tax credits. And what we'll need to see, whether it's first mortgage debt, secondary financing, or equity, are commitment letters for these financing commitments. Another aspect to address in your conversion plan relates to residence rights and requirements. Resident notices and resident meetings are required prior to conversion. There's going to be a prohibition of rescreening residents for Section 8 eligibility upon move-in to the property. That's something to keep in mind. If rehab requires any relocation, residents have a right to return. Post-rehab, it may not be involuntarily displaced. In the Uniform Relocation Act, known as URA, it's going to apply to any relocation. You may also be thinking of transfer of assistance, which is another tool you can use in a RAD for PRAC conversion. Transfer of assistance refers to a change in the geographic site of the assistance. It has the potential to improve the location and quality of housing. What HUD will assess with these transfer requests is that the transfer does not place housing in neighborhoods with highly concentrated poverty. We'll consider whether conversion on-site is economically non-viable, basically if it's physically obsolete or severely distressed, and what the impact is to the residents. As I mentioned before, this is actually where Davis-Bacon wages would apply, and it would apply for any new construction or rehab on properties with 9 or more units where transfers of assistance is considered. Moving into the conversion process, and we'll get started. Probably one of the most important steps is your initial submission of interest. This is where you sign up for an account on the RAD resource desk. You're going to provide basic owner property information about your PRAC that you're wanting to convert. And this is where you actually get a HUD transaction manager assigned to your property for conversion. They'll be walking you all the way through the process. And you have somebody live to actually talk to and ask all your questions too. The next step would be your resident notification and consultation. Again, you need to post written notice, as well as hold at least 2 resident meetings with opportunities to provide comment, and there'll be a 30-day comment period. After that, you need to submit your conversion plan. And that's where you're going to demonstrate physically and financial viability and compliance with program requirements in your RAD for PRAC conversion. Now, from conversion plan to RAD approval, it's typically, we see a 60-day process. That's the average. It can also move along the lines of 120 days or greater. So what I would ask of you all is to, if you know of any issues that may arise during your RAD conversion plan, to keep that in mind, whether it be environmental, maybe you have a financing gap, things of that nature. From RAD approval, you'll have a approval set out in the conversion plan, and it'll set out the terms of closing and construction. Closing will involve the termination of the PRAC, all the releasing of the PRAC applications such as capital advance agreement, your mortgage note, and regulatory agreement, thereby which you'll enter into a Section 8 HAP contract and a RAD elderly housing use agreement. And the last step, and if applicable, your work must be completed in accordance with your conversion agreement. So again, I want to just go back to getting started. Your owner, as an owner, you really want to submit a submission of interest on the RAD resource desk, radresource.net. And again, you're going to provide your basic project and owner information. And again, we'll assign you a HUD transaction manager and be able to provide you some more specific guidance as it relates to your RAD for PRAC transaction. As we noted before, it's of great importance that you review your PRAC budget to ensure that your resident services are at least up to that $15 per unit month maximum now, that you have a line item in your service coordinator for funding salaries, and that your replacement reserves are adequate. Now, owners may use MAP Guide compliant CNA to justify your adjustment to your monthly reserve deposits in your PRAC budget-based rent adjustment request. What we'll be looking for is that the CNA you submit for your RAD conversion is going to be consistent with your budget-based rent adjustment. We are aware currently there is a freeze on budget-based rent adjustments. That will change in the future.
So before we turn to questions, just want to flag for folks that this webinar is part of a series of webinars we're hosting on the release of revision 4 of the RAD notice. For those interested, next week we'll be talking about mod rehab conversions. And then we'll have 2 webinars on specifically geared toward resident rights and RAD conversions with October 17th. The webinar on resident rights in the conversion of 202 PRACs and mod rehab. The registration links are on the slide deck, which will be available on our website and sent around after this presentation. We're also recording all of these webinars, which will be available on HUD.gov/RAD, as well as the RAD resource desk. So thank you. I think we'll turn to questions now. And actually, I want to ask one first question for John, which is the submission of interest on the RAD resource desk. You mentioned that's how you get started. Is there any reason not to submit a submission of interest on the RAD resource desk? Does it commit an owner to doing anything if they make that submission?
That's a great question, Will. So the great thing about your initial submission of interest is there's no commitment. You'll get a HUD Transaction Manager assigned, and we can talk about the RAD for PRAC process and how that may or may not work for your PRAC property. So if you decide to then commit and you want to actually submit an application moving forward, that's great, and you'll actually submit an application. And if you don't, there's no impact to you at all. We'll just withdraw your interest from the RAD resource desk.
Thanks, John. All right, so now we'll turn to questions from those listening in. Folks can raise their hand and ask questions, or folks can write their question in. So we'll look first at some of the written questions that have come in. The first question is, can the slides please be emailed to participants after the webinar? Yes, as described, we will send out the slide deck and the recording of this webinar after once they've been tidied up, and they will also be available on HUD.gov/RAD as well as on the RAD resource desk for folks to view and review as many times as they wish. Okay, there's a question whether we can share the use agreements that will be used, the RAD elderly housing use agreement. So we are in the midst of drafting that use agreement, and it's a good question. We know that it will be of interest to owners and lenders and investors, so we'll have drafts up for that for public review probably in the next few weeks. There's a question of whether an owner should submit a letter of interest before submitting a budget-based rent increase for our next renewal, or should we only submit our letter of interest once we have adjusted our rent pre-conversion? So the 2 steps, whether you come into the Office of Recapitalization with a letter of interest, a submission of interest, and your work with the field office on going through the budget-based rent process are not connected. So you can do both at the same time. You don't have to worry about structuring or phasing, or sequencing one or the other. And it actually helps us because we will be coordinating with field offices, of course, in this process. It's helpful for us to understand where you are in the process, understanding that we might need to kind of wait for the budget-based rent adjustment to play out before you can proceed in earnest on your conversion. So there's a question whether, or if you've already gone through a budget-based rent process, are you required to do so again before coming into the resource desk to convert? No, it's absolutely not required. Your rents might be set adequately today, and whenever you are ready to come in, you can and should do so. There's no requirement that prior to conversion, properties come in for a new budget-based rent increase, but we of course all want to mutually make sure that when the property is converted, that it is viable and will remain viable for the terms of the HAB contract. John, this is one for you. Question, if PBRA is used, would HUD remain the administrator of the contract, or would it be transferred to a PBCA?
Yeah, HUD would remain the administering entity to administer the contract moving forward.
There's a question on the submission of interest. Is that a form requirement or just an email? And who is it sent to? John, can you walk through that?
Sure. So if you go to www.radresource.net, you actually see a way to assign yourself an account or register a new account. After you go ahead and do that, that's when you walk in and you actually see a button that says Submit Initial Interest, and it'll walk you through. It's a little form, maybe about 10 or 12 fields to complete before you can submit your initial interest.
Thanks, John. Okay, here's another one. After conversion, will the apartment still be designated for the elderly? Yes, absolutely. So the use agreement, the RAD elderly housing use agreement, will require that the housing continue to be used and designated for elderly households. Maybe we can talk through this next question, which is, what is the average timing involved in completing this process, starting from the initial inquiry? I think it's going to depend largely on where you are when you begin and provide us your submission of interest. There's no requirement that you have to be at any stage other than interested in converting. But major steps will be procuring a capital needs assessment by a qualified contractor, doing the environmental due diligence, securing any financing commitments that you need. And that could take anywhere from a few months if the property is in solid condition to over a year if the property has greater needs and you need to wait on tax credit rounds before you can submit your conversion plan. And John, what did you say about around how long it takes to review and approve a conversion plan, and then after that?
Yeah, it's about between 60 and 120 days between submission of your application and actual approval. And then thereafter, you can probably see another around 30 to 60 days between approval and closing.
Okay, the next question, what rules will apply to the property after it has converted? Will the 202 PRAC rules apply and those regulations, or will the Section 8 rules apply? So once converted, it will be under a Section 8 HAB contract and no longer subject to 202 PRAC requirements. So the Section 8 or requirements, either PBRA or PBV, will apply. If the property were to go to project-based vouchers, how would an owner connect with a public housing authority who will choose the housing authority and who will assist in that process? So if that is of interest, with the Office of Recap, we'll work with the Public Housing Field Office to identify a housing authority who has jurisdiction to administer contracts in that area, and we'll identify an eligible housing authority. Why don't we go to the line for the next one?
All right, Angela Steele, do you have a question?
Yes, I was just curious if the When you say PRAC rents, if that will be based on the operating cost standard for the year in which you apply for conversion, or based on your actual rents that are in your property financials? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. It is based on the rents that you have today, the PRAC rents that are in place prior to conversion. So whether those are the ones you have today, or if you're to go through a budget-based rent adjustment before the property converts, it is those rents. Thank you for your question. I'll take another one, if there is another one.
Shayna Daddy, do you have a question?
Yeah, so through the budget-based rent increase process, is it anticipated that increasing the annual replacement reserve deposit and the social service line item will create rents that are sufficient to leverage debt, since these deals were historically operating at break even?
Yeah, so first, thanks for that question, Shayna. So of course, modifying the rents to take care of to address service costs would put the property in a better position to support service costs going forward. And yes, in terms of the replacement reserves, looking at the actual capital needs of the property, the true replacement needs of the property, and funding those, modifying the PRAC rents to account for what the reserve deposits would need to be, would or could make room for supporting debt service once the property is then on a Section 8 contract and no longer has restrictions on supporting debt. So we would not be adjusting the PRAC rents, or HUD would not be adjusting the PRAC rents based on an assumption of debt service and what it would cost in debt service, but rather would be adjusting the reserves in order to reflect the true replacement needs of the property. Thank you. There's a question on proceeds. Maybe John and I can tag team on this. If ownership is transferring, will some proceeds be allowed to be received by the seller? So we talked about this briefly earlier, that there is an opportunity for sales proceeds. Those sales proceeds could be realized by the seller and would generally be restricted for affordable housing purposes. But the RAD notice goes into some detail on certain exceptions to an amounts of those proceeds that would not be restricted. But affordable housing purposes generally means other affordable housing that you're doing, whether it's other development costs or in some other property, resident services, pre-development expenses, other forms of affordable housing work. Okay. Okay, we have another question. Whether, John, I'll turn this one to you. Can a conversion plan and the financing proposed include PRAC projects that are converting along with non-PRAC projects? So we'll answer that question first. Is it possible for an owner to take multiple properties that they have and finance them together? Well, let's say only one of those properties is a PRAC converting to Section 8 under RAD.
Yeah, we've seen sibling properties under the same financing instrument before. That'll be, again, something you can use with a RAD for PRAC conversion as well.
Okay. And I think the second part of this question is, if the other property is already under a Section 8 contract, would those would that Section 8 contract be merged with the new Section 8 contract from the PRAC conversion, or would they have to be distinct half contracts?
Yeah, I believe it's going to be. They'll have to be distinct because there's going to be different requirements, but for the RAD for PRAC PBRA contract and the other Section 8 contract you have at your property.
Okay, we've got one more question here I want to address, whether there's a limit on the number of 202 PRAC projects that a sponsor can submit for conversion. John?
Submit away.
Okay, so there's no limitation. Okay, we have another caller who'd like to talk. Hey, Sheena, welcome back.
Thank you. Is developer fee permissible on these, like it is for some of the other RAD programs?
Yes.
And what is the amount?
We will generally cede to tax credit limits, QAP limits on developer fees, and we'll otherwise make sure that costs are reasonable. But we do not have explicit limits on developer fee amounts.
What if there are no tax credits?
So I think you should talk with us separately. Maybe send in your question or talk through your scenario with one of our transaction managers, and we'll work that out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So back to the use agreement, there's another question of where will it be posted. So it'll go through what we call at HUD the Paperwork Reduction Act process, which means it will get posted publicly and announced through the Federal Register. We'll, of course, let everyone know through a RAD blast. If you haven't signed up for a RAD blast, by the way, please do so. Just look up HUD listserv and look up RAD, and you can sign up. We don't send spam. We'll send basically a monthly note on updates on the program. So we will announce when those documents are available for public comment via a RAD blast. Question of whether or not somebody would like to have a conversation with the transaction manager, they should provide a submission of interest. It would be helpful just so we know where your property is and have some basic information. It allows us to more easily assign workload if you could provide a submission of interest. But if you have, one-off questions, you can always send that to rad2@hud.gov, and we can we can route it in the right place. Okay, another question, John. How soon would a transaction manager be assigned once a submission of interest is sent into HUD?
Yeah, you usually be contacted within a business week's time.
Okay, thanks, John. Okay, there's a question on, we commented that as part of the RAD conversion process, we'll be looking at a CNA that you submit to assess the capital needs of the property and make sure that they are addressed as part of the conversion. But some owners will also use a CNA before conversion to justify changes to their budget-based rents. And there's a question on how will we make sure that they're consistent. So we would expect that the CNAs are both MAP Guide compliant, that they have the same replacement components over the years and covering all parts of the property. So what we want to be careful of is potentially an owner showing greater capital needs as part of a budget-based rent process and deflating those capital needs when they come in to us to convert the property. That's the primary thing we're attempting to safeguard against, and we'll make sure wouldn't happen. So there's a question about where the budget-based rent adjustments take place. So they continue to occur at the field office, continue to occur with your account executives, so keep working with them on that. We are, again, we'll be generally coordinating with field offices on what they're seeing so that we can anticipate the workload and can work with them upfront as needed. But your point of contact continues to be the field office for any budget-based rent adjustments. It's a very basic question submitted. Why are the Section 8 half rents the same as the PRAC rents? The authorization we were given for RAD to convert to 2 PRACs did not come with any additional money. So we do not have a separate pot of funds with which to fund rents that are based on market, and therefore our limitation is that the HAP contract rents should be the same as the PRAC rents. Again, we talked about how those rents could be adjusted before, the PRAC rents could be adjusted before conversion, but we don't have a separate pot of funds to increase rents as part of the conversion itself. So that is why we have this process. Okay, we've got another one on the phone. Hi, Debbie. You're on the line.
Debbie Fisher, you might need to unmute your line. All right.
All right.
Debbie.
We'll go back to some of the written questions. We have a question on the benefits of project-based rental assistance or project-based vouchers. Generally, we've heard from most owners who've been engaged in public feedback or public feedback process, as well as who've been talking to us so far, primarily been interested in PBRA. That's, but I think, largely driven by the fact that they can continue to use the systems that they're set up, software and systems that they're set up to use, that they continue to have the same contacts at the field with HUD, and many of those owners also already own multifamily Section 8 properties with those contracts. We've not heard a lot of interest yet in converting to project-based vouchers, where owners will have to form new relationships with a housing authority. Project-based vouchers also have a lower contract rent cap, so it's 110% of the FMR versus 120% of the FMR for PBRA, which will be an issue for some properties, depending on where their PRAC rents are currently set. We expect the vast majority of conversions of this stock to be to project-based rental assistance. Related to a previous question, if a property is anticipating requesting a budget-based rent increase, should this happen before beginning the process of a RAD conversion? So it should occur before you submit a full conversion plan to us, but you do not need to wait for that in order to provide us a submission of interest. And it'll be actually helpful for us and for you that you are engaged with us as you are going through that process, so we can make sure that we are coordinated with the field office. There's another question. We've discussed how properties will continue to be designated for the elderly. There's another question. Will the income limits continue to be very low income, or 50% of area median income? Yes, they will continue to be 50% of AMI. Clarification on the designation for elderly, whether it's just for the elderly or for the elderly and non-elderly disabled. The designation is just for elderly, age 62 and higher. Related question on capital needs assessments and the adjustments for reserves. The question is, since the rents are structured to only cover operating expenses, operating costs, and reserves, how is it possible to borrow any money for the project? We'll remember that any adjustments on the budget-based rents based on higher reserve deposits will not assume that there's any upfront rehab. So if property goes through a budget-based rent adjustment to account for the need for higher reserve deposits, and then subsequently plans to convert the property through RAD using 4% tax credits and bonds, much of that work will be completed through rehab, and the ongoing reserve deposits, once on the Section 8 contract, could be lower. So that's where one of the areas where we see there'd be room to support debt. There's a question on, again, on budget-based rents, whether it's possible to do mid-year rent increases or whether you have to wait for the annual contract renewal. HUD's standard practice is to do them only at the annual contract renewal. There is an exception process every so often for mid-year rent increases, but it's usually in more extreme circumstances. So we recommend talking with your account executive, but in most cases, owners will likely need to rely on the annual renewal process. Question, a clarification on the release of the capital advance documents, whether the capital advance mortgage will be discharged along with the use agreement. Yes, all the existing capital advance documentation will go away. There will be no more, the note will be fully released and replaced with the RAD use agreement, the RAD elderly housing use agreement. Question on the timing of a CNA, if there was one done a year ago or over a year ago, and the owner is interested in conversion, what is the time frame, an acceptable time frame or age of the CNA that is submitted for the purposes of the conversion? John, remind me, we say the CNA must be completed within 12 months of the conversion plan?
It's going to be within 12 months of conversion. So if it's dated later, if it's outdated, we would request a new CNA.
Which may be an update of that CNA, it might be a brand new CNA.
Right.
There's a question about the cost of the CNA, whether it can be funded from replacement reserves. And the answer is yes, that owners are allowed to use replacement reserves to pay for the capital needs assessment. Clarification on what the RAD Elderly Housing Use Agreement will require for additional affordability. So it adds 20 years to however many years are remaining on the current capital advance use agreement. So if a property is 20 years into its agreement and converts under RAD, it has the 20 years remaining on the old agreement plus a new 20 years. So the new RAD Elderly Housing Use Agreement would be for 40 years. Note, by the way, we have a cap on that of 60 years in total. So in no event would that exceed 60 years. A question about post-conversion rent adjustments. So we described how once on the Section 8 contract, the rents would then be inflated each year at the anniversary date by the OCAF. They would no longer be subject to or eligible for a budget-based rent increase. So it's 20 years of OCAF, and then following those 20 years, the contract, if it's a PBRA contract, would renew under MARA. Okay, there's a question about timing. How will HUD look at a property that is just renewing its PRAC contract? So it just went through a renewal, its one-year renewal last month. So for PBRA conversions, there is, and really, yeah, for PBRA conversions, there is, we can convert a property at any point during the year. We do not need to wait for the anniversary date of the HAP contract. For PBV conversions, there's some special considerations there on when the conversion can occur and when the HAP can be effective. But for PBRA, we can convert, complete the conversion of properties at any point during the year, regardless of the anniversary date of the contract. Good question. Thank you. The question about whether a rent comparability study would be required. Nope. The rents are limited at the lower, for PBRA, at the lower of the PRAC rents, or 120% of the FMR or small area FMR. So there is no need to do a rent comparability study. Question on whether there's a list of all the 202 PRAC properties. We are going to check on this. There might be some publicly available data that HUD, that Office of Multifamily Housing has already put out on all of its contracts with some basic information, but we'll check on this and see if there's a gap in that, if we can make some available on our website. and some people have commented already that there is a database that's publicly accessible. Thank you. Sure, let's do one more phone question, but we're going to have to wrap up in a minute. But Mary, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, Will. How are you?
All right.
Good. We're getting ready to post some comments to the notice regarding the eligibility of applicants, and you've been talking a lot about the rent setting for the PRAC to RAD. And in the component ones, we're allowed to, and in the current PRAC program, we're allowed to move residents in even if the assistance payment is 0 or negative. And in component 2, which is PRAC is falling in component 2, we're not allowed to do that. And I'm just concerned that with the rent so low, are residents going to be able to be placed? Are we going to be making it so that residents who currently are eligible from an applicant standpoint would not be eligible if we converted to PBRA RAD?
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate the question. So I think for other listeners, what you're referring to is that you can't typically admit a family into a property if, even though they're income eligible, if 0.5 would be paid. We've run some numbers on this, and we think that in the PRAC context, it will not be a significant issue, but we'll continue to analyze this, and appreciate that you brought it to our attention to make sure we continue to focus on it in case it does become an issue, or to at least flag where potential properties where it could be an issue. Thanks, Mary. Property. Okay, so I know we have some other questions, and some of them are fairly specific, or we might need to get some additional clarification on. We'll do our best as we can to work through these over email with some of the individuals that have sent those questions in. We are going to wrap up this webinar. We really appreciate those who've been able to join and focus and ask us good questions. Please keep sending them in so we can continue to make sure we can get good information out to folks along the way. Thank you all for participating again, and have a great rest of the day.